Hello, everybody. As Professor Barth, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University, welcome to Foundations of Western Political Thought. This is the fourth installment in our series. We've taken a look at Thucydides, Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, and today we inaugurate our section on John Locke, liberal champion of natural rights, referred to by many intellectual historians as the founder of modern liberalism. And certainly, he was one of the greatest and most influential thinkers of the Enlightenment. You could maybe argue that he was the most influential thinker of the Enlightenment, had a profound influence across the 18th centuries and the decades after his death in 1704, influenced the French philosophers from Voltaire to Rousseau, the British imperialists, the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, David Hume, and of course on the American revolutionaries. We think of Thomas Jefferson in particular in that Declaration of Independence. But his main cause was the basic natural rights of individuals, which he argued should be protected by limited representative government, the consent of the governed, grounded on a social contract formulated by and for the people, and which, if broken, the people could alter or abolish that government. He is, again, one of the founding thinkers of classical liberalism. Locke was born in 1632 in the southwest of England near Bristol. He was 10 years old when the English Civil War erupted. So, major event in his childhood. In fact, his father served as a captain in the cavalry for Parliament. And so Locke was steeped in pro-parliamentarian sentiment. Now, when he was 14 years old, in the midst of this Civil War, in 1646, he enrolled at the highly prestigious Westminster School in London. And while he was there, he studied Greek, Latin, Hebrew, read texts in all three of those languages, studied mathematics. King Charles I was beheaded when Locke was 16 years old. Even though Locke was in London at the time, he was actually not permitted to attend the execution. And England was without a king for a little more than a decade. As a young adult at the age of 20 in 1652, Locke entered Christ Church, which is the largest college at the University of Oxford. And it was there that Locke really developed as a young man into what he would later become. And if you've ever visited Christ Church in Oxford, it is a beautiful campus buildings. Actually, you can go in the dining hall, and there's a portrait of John Locke in that dining hall. At the time that Locke attended Christ Church, Oliver Cromwell was the chancellor, and the Puritan theologian, John Owen, a very brilliant theologian. If you've ever tried to read any of his texts, it's extraordinarily dense. Puritan thinker, John Owen was vice chancellor and dean of Christ Church in the 1650s. There's the main building, the library at Christ Church. Locke also had the privilege of studying chemistry and medicine under none other than Robert Boyle, who's considered the first modern chemist. So, quite an education as a young man in the 1650s at Christ Church. Locke graduated with a bachelor's degree in 1656 and a master's in 1658. When Locke was 28 years old, Charles II, the son of the beheaded king, Charles I, returned from exile to England. The crown was restored, and for the next quarter century, Charles was king. Now, in the second video in the series, part 2, we'll do a brief and not exhaustive survey of this period in English history so we have an idea of where Locke was coming from. We'll look at this part of English history from 1660 all the way up through the 1690s through the perspective of Locke. What was Locke doing during this time? And we'll take a close look at that for part 2. What we will mostly emphasize in this series is the second treatise of government, authored by Locke sometime in the 1680s, although it was not published until 1689. And in this second treatise of government, we have Locke at his finest. In the second treatise, Locke argues that there are 3 natural rights in particular that men possess, or women too. It gives this to all human beings, that are unalienable, that cannot be separated from that person, that are endowed to that person by God, by their creator, and those are life, liberty, and property, or sometimes Locke referred to it as life, liberty, and estates. But this life, liberty, and property are the core natural rights. We will flesh this out in either part 3 or part 4 of this series. This is just the general overview right now, the introduction, if you will. And then Locke elaborated on his theory of social contract. And according to the Lockean social contract, the people form an agreement, a contract with the state, with the executive and legislative powers. And in that contract, the people, each individual, surrenders his or her absolute right in a state of nature to the state, and they do that in order to preserve and protect their lives, their liberties, their properties. Under Locke's system, the legislature is the supreme power because it is the law-making authority. It is the branch of government that creates laws. However, Locke emphasizes, this legislature is only a fiduciary power. They exist only based on trust. The legislature and government in general is entrusted by the people to act for very particular ends. And that's for the public good and for the protection of natural rights. Again, we will flesh all of this out in parts 3 and 4 of this series. Just a general overview here in part 1. Also, Locke says, this contract is conditional. If the state breaks a contract, and the phrase that Locke uses is through a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, it becomes an unlawful tyranny. And once it's a tyranny, the people are no longer bound to submit to that government. The contract is null and void, and the people have a right to dissolve and replace it with a new government. So that's the essence of Locke's second treatise. Now, if you are familiar at all with the United States Declaration of Independence, wow, there's just so much here, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson substitutes pursuit of happiness for property there. That to secure these rights, government is instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. So much Locke here in just the Declaration of Independence, but again, across the entirety of the 18th century. Immensely influential. And it's why I'm very excited for this series. We're going to dive deep. We're going to dive deep into Locke. We'll look at this second treatise and we'll parse through it, and I think you'll really enjoy it. Now, it's useful, since we just finished Hobbes last fall, to compare Lockean social contract with Hobbesian social contract theory. Now, if you haven't seen the series on Thomas Hobbes, I recommend you do so. But in short, Hobbes had his own social contract theory, but in Hobbes' social contract, the people form a covenant with each other. The covenant is between and amongst the people, every man with every man. That's a quote from Hobbes. And the people form that covenant, and the crux of that covenant is that they surrender right to an artificial man, the sovereign, personified here on the front piece of Hobbes' book, Leviathan. The sovereign represents that covenant, represents the people. The sovereign is the representative of the people. If you look closely here, all over the king is, all over the sovereign are the various people of the kingdom. But this covenant cannot be broken. It cannot be broken. Why? Well, the covenant isn't between the state and the people. The covenant is between the people. And so because of the nature of that covenant, each individual is, in effect, author of everything that the sovereign does, all actions, all of it. And so there's no right to form a new covenant. Every person is obliged or bound to submit to the laws of the sovereign because they created the sovereign through this covenant amongst themselves. Locke's social contract theory is one between the people and the government. Okay, see that difference? One between and amongst the people, the other between the people and the government. The people agree to abide by known laws, by standing rules that are respectful of natural law and respectful of their basic natural rights as citizens. And so long as the government does that, the people vow allegiance. They submit to the government and to its laws. The governing authorities, on the other hand, agree, according to this contract, to act only for the public good, not for the private good, but for the public good, and vow to govern with respect to natural law. Locke is very specific here. He says that the governing authorities, according to his contract, will only levy taxes with the consent of the people. This becomes very important in the context of the American Revolution because Parliament wanted to raise taxes without the consent of the colonists. To only levy taxes with the consent of the people and to refrain from the use of arbitrary absolute power. Okay, so that's the contract in Locke. And Locke is very determined to emphasize, and throughout the second treatise, he emphasizes that the people retain the supreme power. The supreme power of what? Well, if the people are the supreme power, then it is the people who determines if the contract has been broken. If the people determine that the government is not holding its end of the bargain, then they can form a new contract, a new government. They can alter this government. The contract, in effect, has been broken. It's been severed. The contract cannot be severed here. The contract can be severed in this case. So that's an important difference in social contract theory between Hobbes and Locke. One note, you'll see here it says Two Treatises of Government. And I've been talking about the second treatise. Well, where's the first treatise? Why the second treatise? Well, if you look, Two Treatises of Government, in the former, meaning the first treatise, the false principles and foundation of Sir Robert Filmer and his followers are detected and overthrown. In the latter, meaning the second treatise, an essay concerning the origin, extent, and end of civil government. We focus on the second treatise. The first treatise is primarily concerned, or exclusively concerned, with critiquing the theory of divine right. There was a man, Robert Filmer, Sir Robert Filmer, who wrote a book, Patriarcha, actually wrote it in the 1630s, but it wasn't published until 1680, posthumously. Filmer died in the 1650s. But in Patriarcha, Filmer critiques all social contract theory and defends divine right of kings. Locke endeavors to destroy that idea in the first treatise of government. There are a few good quotes, though, in the first treatise of government that are worth mentioning in this introduction. Locke says this in the first treatise: "The imagination is always restless and suggests a variety of thoughts, and the will, reason being laid aside, is ready for every extravagant project. And in this state, he that goes farthest out of the way is thought fittest to lead, and is sure of the most followers." What is Locke saying here? That human beings have a tendency to dream up these sometimes wild ideas, these extravagant ideas, and when reason is laid aside, when men are not thinking in the right state of mind, they are prone to follow some of these wild imaginary ideas. And oftentimes those who go farthest in pursuing these wild ideas earn the most followers. Locke continues, "And when fashion hath once established what folly or craft began, custom makes it sacred, and 'twill be thought impudence or madness to contradict or question it." So what began as a wild idea, as a product of a wild imagination, all of a sudden becomes fashionable as it gains followers. And once it becomes fashionable, even though it had its origins in folly, now it's becomes custom. And then after a long time of being custom, it becomes sacred. So sacred, in fact, that anyone who questions it will be thought mad, even though the origins of this idea was, in fact, in madness. Locke here is talking about divine right of kings. He's saying that the idea of divine right of kings is madness, it's folly, it's foolish, it's the product of a strange imagination. But because it had become fashionable, because it had become customary, and suddenly, by the early 17th century, sacred, no one was thought to be allowed to question it. "He that will impartially survey the nations of the world will find so much of the government's religion and manners brought in and continued amongst them by these means, that they will have but little reverence for the practices which are in use and credit amongst men." Locke here is saying that so much of what we take for granted, so many of the customs, traditions, manners, ideas, we take for granted. Forms of government, we take for granted. But an impartial look at things will note that many of these ideas, many of these customs had their origin in this folly or craft, a restless imagination that, and not the product of reason, not the product of reason. And so, in light of that, Locke says, honestly, we ought to have little reverence for the customs and traditions of men. In other words, we ought to reevaluate many of these ideas many of these forms, many of these customs with an objective, impartial, rational eye. Let's apply reason and reevaluate everything. This is the Enlightenment. Okay, Enlightenment is written all over for this. The Age of Reason. This is also, you see, Locke's liberalism here. Now, conservatism in the modern sense does not yet exist during this time. Many people argue, I think correctly, that Edmund Burke is the father of modern conservatism. Sir Roger Scruton, the late Roger Scruton, has argued, I think persuasively, that conservatism actually came out of liberalism, but that conservatism was a hesitation within liberalism, so that the conservative, while agreeing with many liberal ideas, thinks the liberal goes too far in eschewing or putting aside customs and traditions, that they're too quick to want to apply reason to everything. We'll flesh that out later, much later, when we look at Edmund Burke. But here Locke is saying, hey, everything is up for grabs. Let's look with a rational, impartial eye at these ideas that have been taken for granted for so long. It's also important in this introduction to counter a common misperception about Locke. Many people think that Locke was this, radical libertarian, and to be sure, he had libertarian tendencies. I'm not denying that. However, he is not, an extreme libertarian. He believed that there was a role for the government to restrain individual action and even individual liberty. Look at Locke's definition of freedom, offered up in the Second Treatise of Government. Freedom, he says, is not a liberty for everyone to do what he desires or to live as he pleases and not to be tied down by any laws. No. Freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to everyone of that society and made by the legislative power erected in it. So this is the difference between liberty and license. True freedom does not mean that you can do whatever you want, any impulse that you want to do, go ahead and do it. Even if you're not violating the harm principle, right? Locke does not believe that you should be allowed to do anything you want so long as you don't harm somebody else. That's not Locke's view, actually. Locke is sympathetic to that libertarian ideal. However, for Locke, true freedom is to live under a government where there, again, is a standing rule to live by that is common to everyone in that society and that is made by the legislative power erected in it. A liberty, then, to follow my own wills in all things where the rule prescribes not. So when the government doesn't restrain behavior, you retain a liberty to follow your own will. And then lastly, a government freedom is living in a condition where you are not subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man. That's the core of freedom. Not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man. I like that definition of freedom. I think he's right on point there. What do you think? So, Locke, of course, we'll focus on the second treatise in this series. He did so much more. In the 1690s in particular, he was very, very prolific and a lot of output in the 1690s. In 1695, he published a text on the recoinage controversy. If you've watched my History of Money series, in the 1690s, the English coinage was severely clipped, and there was a question on whether or not the English mint ought to devalue the pound sterling. Locke argued very powerfully and quite persuasively that it would be a mistake to devalue the coinage, but that rather the standard weights and measures of the pound sterling ought to be retained. Locke also very famously authored a book called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And in this book, he developed his theory of epistemology, the study of knowledge, a study of knowing. How do we know what we know? And he advances theory of knowledge that the human mind essentially is born as a tabula rasa, a blank slate. Locke never uses that exact term. He uses the phrase white paper, but it means the same thing. That the mind is not, that humans are not born with pre-filled knowledge. Rather, knowledge arises purely from sensory experience. Locke says this: if we attentively consider newborn children, we shall have little reason to think that they bring many ideas into the world with them. One may perceive how, by degrees, afterwards, ideas come into their minds, but they get no more nor no other than what experience and the observation of things that come in their way furnish them with. Again, you get you see the liberalism of Locke here, right? This is quite liberal. This comports very well with the Lockean notion of the free individual, Lockean individualism. Locke sides very strongly with nurture, and because of that, skipping through a little bit here, because of that, Locke also published a book on education, some thoughts concerning education, because if knowledge arises from sensory experience, then that puts all the more burden on the power of education. This book was very, very influential on the philosophy of education, and in it, Locke emphasized the extreme importance of instilling virtue in children. He says this: virtue is harder to begot than knowledge of the world, and if lost in a young man, is seldom recovered. Well, where do they get virtue? They have to get virtue through experience. In those early ages, it's very, very important. Locke actually tells fathers in the book, fathers, you need to set a strong example for your children. Going back to some of these quotes, in his essay concerning human understanding, Locke elaborates a little more on this idea that reason ought to govern all of our actions, and that we ought to evaluate everything through the lens of reason. He says this: there cannot any one moral rule be proposed whereof a man may not justly demand a reason. Stated differently, if someone tells you that something is right or wrong, you ought to, and it is perfectly just and critical, vital, that you demand a reason why, so that you can analyze it rationally. Where is the man, Locke asks, that has incontestable evidence of the truth of all that he holds, or of the falsehood of all he condemns, or can say that he has examined to the bottom all his own or other men's opinions? Here we see the skeptic in Locke assert himself. At least those who have not thoroughly examined to the bottom all their own tenets must confess they are unfit to prescribe to others. And such people are unreasonable in imposing that as truth on other men's belief, which they themselves have not searched into. Those who have fairly and truly examined, and are thereby got past doubt in all the doctrines they profess and govern themselves by, would have a juster pretense to require others to follow them, but these are so few in number. Very few people take the time to critically analyze their own beliefs. They just they take so much for granted. There is reason to think, Locke says, that if men were better instructed themselves, they would be less imposing on others. All men are liable to error, and most men are, in many points, by passion or interest, under temptation to it. If we could but see the secret motives that influence the men of name and learning in the world and the leaders of parties, we should not always find that it was the embracing of truth for its own sake that made them espouse the doctrines they owned and maintained. Locke the skeptic. Everything needs to be subjected to reason. And much of what we have in the world today, according to Locke, is not the product of reason. Not the product of reason whatsoever. Very few cases has truth been embraced for its own sake. Two final works here to look at concerning Locke in this introduction. Locke in 1689 wrote a famous letter concerning toleration, which advocated for a very broad religious toleration in England. He had two exceptions, atheists and Roman Catholics. You might say, wow, that's not very tolerant. Well, Roman Catholics, he said, their first allegiance is to the Pope. Locke was very, very critical of Roman Catholicism. He saw Roman Catholics as, besides having a competing allegiance, he believed that the Roman Catholic hierarchy caused most Roman Catholics to support more absolutist forms of government. That Roman Catholicism, something about it is just naturally hostile to political liberty. So Locke was a committed Protestant. Atheism was also dangerous. Locke actually very strongly defended the existence of God, who he believed you could prove through reason and through natural reason, not simply revelation. And so he had those two exceptions in there. Here was that exception. Those are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of a God. Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are bound of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist. The taking away of God, though but even in thought, dissolves all. So the belief in God is so important for Locke that the society cannot tolerate atheism. That once a society no longer believes in God, there's no foundation to stand on anymore. So that was the one exception. Other than that, well, in Roman Catholicism, for all these Protestant sects, including Quakers, Baptists, nonconformists of all types, Locke said there should be no discrimination, no restriction whatsoever on those Protestant religions. And then lastly, in 1695, Locke defended the orthodoxies of Christianity in a popular book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. And just one quote from that book. When I had gone through the whole and saw what a plain, simple, reasonable thing Christianity was, suited to all conditions and capacities, and in the morality of it now, with divine authority established into a legible law, so far surpassing all that philosophy and human reason had attained to, or could possibly make effectual to all degrees of mankind, I was flattered to think it might be of some use in the world, especially to those who thought either that there was no need of revelation at all, or that the revelation of our Savior required the belief of such articles for salvation, which the settled notions and their way of reasoning in some, and want of understanding in others, made impossible to them. I bring this up for two reasons. I myself am a Christian, but I think there is a misconception out there that Locke is this very secular thinker, and certainly Christianity did not infiltrate all of his writings. It did not. But Locke was a committed Protestant and did not shy away from defending some of those Christian doctrines. And so something to consider, that we don't create this caricature of Locke as this sort of proto-Thomas Paine, ultra rational to the point of rejecting rejecting anything that had to do with the supernatural. He was not like that. By the way, Newton was not like that either. Sir Isaac Newton also actually published several works on more spiritual, mystical matters. So that's Locke, and that's our introduction. Hope this was interesting, and I'm looking forward to diving in. Part 2 will be historical. We'll take a look. What's the context? We don't want to separate the text from the time in which it was written. So what was the world? What's going on in England at the time that Locke publishes this very excellent book, the Second Treatise of Government? See you for part 2.